Dr. Jochen Lingelbach, and our own professor, Lwangalu, who is going to give his comments, questions as a discussant to Dr. Lingelbach's talk. Jochen Lingelbach is a postdoctoral research fellow in African history at the University of Bayreuth, and this is in Germany. He obtained his doctorate at the University of Leipzig and currently works on the project of Africa in the Global History of Refugee Camps within the University of Bayreuth's Africa Multiple Cluster Excellence. He's the author of On the Edges of Whiteness, Polish Refugees in British Colonial Africa during and after the Second World War. And this book was published in 2020 by Bagham Books. We are happy to have you, all of you, and especially our presenter. And right now, I would like to hand over to Jochen. Please, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Edgar, and thank you, Christopher, for the kind introduction and for inviting me here. And thank you, everyone, for showing an interest. And a very special thank to Professor Sambiri Lwangalu, who's hopefully now here. Professor Lwangalu had written one of the very first papers on the Polish refugees in Uganda. He presented it at a conference in 1993 already at Makerere University. And it was published in 1998 under the title Uganda's Long Connection with the Problem of Refugees, from the Polish refugees of World War II to the present, in an edited volume with Makerere University Press. So it's really a pleasure and an honor to have him here as a discussant. I'm not sure if he remembers, but I remember vividly, we met in 2013 and had when I was doing research for my PhD, out of which my book came. And we had a very important for me and memorable conversation, and it really helped me in directing my further research and in eventually writing my book. So I'm really glad and honored that he's here today. So as Christopher already said, I'm working on the history of refugee camps now. So I'm working on the relation of international UN refugee organizations and colonial rule in Africa, focusing on the 1940s to 50s and partly also to the 1960s, focusing on Ugandan history, but also on refugee camps for Europeans in other parts of Africa. In April 2020, so 2 years ago, I had planned to do a workshop at Makerere University on this issue and on other struggles around mobility. But then, unfortunately, it was canceled on short notice, so I didn't have a chance to come to Kampala since then because of the pandemic. So hopefully soon I will be there in present again. But now, at least I'm online here, so I'm really glad to be here. So this presentation is based on my book. Let me just start the presentation. So this presentation is based on my book, On the Edges of Whiteness, Polish Refugees in British Colonial Africa During and After the Second World War. That was published in 2020, and which is again based on my PhD project on Polish refugees. I thereby did archival research and interviews in many countries. That it was in Britain, in France, in Kenya, in Tanzania, and also in Uganda. In the book, I take a wider transnational or regional approach, covering all the countries where Polish refugees were, all the colonies. But in this presentation today, I'm going to focus on Uganda. So my main question I'm pursuing in my book and also here today is, how did the colonial administrators react to this massive influx of destitute white European refugees? And how did also, on the other hand, how did Africans see these people who looked like the colonizers, but were also quite different in their position? And how did the refugees themselves experience this unlikely and initially unwanted sojourn? They didn't want to come there, they just had to. So all this goes back to the question: where did they fit into this world of world of colonial societies that was so divided? And I think there's no one clear answer, but different answers depending on the perspectives and the positions of the different historical actors involved. And I close it with a general plea for attention to the complexities of late colonial societies in Africa and in Uganda in this case. And also with the following an intersectional approach to colonial history where next to race, also gender, class, nationality, and religion and age are all important in the social categorization, self-identification, and the feelings of belonging. So that said, let me briefly give my outline. Okay, so we'll first start with the prehistory, the how and why did the Polish refugees come to Uganda. Then I will focus on the Ugandan camps, the two Ugandan camps that were established in Uganda. That was Nyabyea near Masindi, and then Kodya in Mukono district. And in the next part, I will contrast different perspectives on this position of the Polish refugees within colonial societies, and then conclude briefly. So this is what I try to fit in the time without talking too fast, but not too long. So let's start. We have to start 1939, actually, to understand what's happening here with the start of the Second World War. So it all started with the German attack of Poland in 1939. Hitler and Stalin had agreed in a secret pact that Poland was to be divided in two parts, with the western part coming under Nazi German occupation and the eastern part under Soviet rule. On both sides, the people were suffering under brutal occupation regimes. And the people who eventually came to Uganda were from the eastern part, the part that was occupied by the Soviets then. In order to secure their rule and to get rid of any possible opposition, in winter 1940, the Soviet authorities started the forced deportation of hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens from the eastern part of Poland to labor camps and special settlements in the Soviet interior. You see these arrows on the map, they're just for illustration. It's not the exact, it's much more complex the way they were deported, but that gives the brief directions. So they were deported and had to stay in horrible conditions and fight for survival. Many also died in these labor camps in the Soviet interior. All of this changed when in 1941, the Germans suddenly attacked the Soviet Union, despite the fact that they before had an agreement that they would not attack each other. But this was broken by the Nazis. So after this sudden attack, the Soviet Union was in dire need for any support it could get because German troops were really advancing fast. So in July 1941, the Polish exile government that was sitting in London at that time reached a British brokered agreement with the Moscow government, and these included the release of all Polish prisoners in the Soviet Union. The released Poles were supposed to form a Polish army to help and fight with the Allies, with the Soviet and the British, against Germany. And this army was eventually evacuated over the Caspian Sea to British-controlled Iran at that time. So you see these arrows going down over this lake or sea, and partly also over land, but most went over by ship. So this is an image of the people arriving in Iran, in Pahlavi, in 1942. The British army in Iran welcomed the Polish soldiers and were happy to get more additions to their ranks. So the Polish army came under the British Supreme Command and was then setting off to fight in the Middle East, in North Africa, and in Italy against the Italians and the Germans. But with the Polish soldiers, also around 40,000 Polish civilians, mainly women and children, arrived in Iran, to the surprise of the British army there. So they had to do something with these civilians that were connected to the army, but were not part of the army. So the British planners decided, for strategic and security reasons, they were too close to the war theaters, too close to the fighting, so they had to send them somewhere. So the British central government went around asking where can they be brought, and in the end it were the colonial governments in Africa and in India that were convinced or accepted to host these Polish civilians for the duration of the war. So in 1942, about 18,000 of them were shipped to East and Central Africa, spread over the different colonies. On this map on the left side, you see the location of the different refugee camps. There were about 20 refugee camps. And the size of the dots is indicating the size of the camp, so the number of inhabitants. On the very top, you see Masindi and Kodja there, that were the second and third largest. Tengeru in northern Tanzania was the largest camp. And down right in this chart, you see that the distribution was not even. It was about 1/3 of refugees were in Tanganyika and 1/3 were in Uganda, while the others took less refugees. Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, so Zambia and Zimbabwe now. And Kenya also was more of a transit for them. So to get an idea of the dimensions involved, in Uganda, the largest group of whites during the Second World War were Polish refugees. There was only some 2,500 European residents in 1948. But then in addition, there were 7,000 Poles. In Tanganyika, roughly every second white resident during wartime was a Polish refugee. So although these numbers are not really big, it's roughly nearly 20,000. Nevertheless, in comparison to the white population, especially in the non-settler colonies, it was a really large, massive group. So let me zoom in on Uganda here, the camps in Uganda. So Uganda hosted more than 1/3 of all Polish refugees in Africa. In contrast to the many smaller camps in the other British colonies, the Poles in Uganda were concentrated in only 2 large refugee camps that were not attached to any existing institution. So they were in Kodja in Mukono district, as you can see here, and in Nyabyaya near Masindi. It was in the files, it's often called Masindi camp, although it was Nyabyaya, which is 30 kilometers away. So, so why the choice for these 2 places? When the colonial government was looking for places to put the refugees, they had some criteria. The one was they need to have an availability of land, and they needed some transport connections. So the refugees came by ship to Mombasa, then by train via Nairobi up, and to Kodja they made the last leg of the trip by lorry. To Masindi they went up by train to Namasagali, and then by boat over the Nile and Lake Kyoga to Masindi port, and then again the last leg of the trip was by lorry up to Nyabyaya. But there was also another reason that the colonial officials chose these 2 places, and that was namely that they wanted to have isolated places. They searched for, now a quote from a British colonial official there, they were searching for, quote, districts where the Poles, a European and white race, could till the land out of the sight of natives. So to make this clear, they were fearing the influence on the position and prestige of whites if Africans were seeing these poor white refugees. So both Nyabyaya in the forest of the thinly populated kingdom of Bunyoro and Kodja on an isolated peninsula in Lake Victoria largely met these criteria. I will now go first to Masindi, Nyabyaya, and then to Kodja. So Masindi settlement, as it was called in the sources, is rather isolated on a hill near Nyabyaya village in the midst of Budongo forest. You can see now on this current map, it's on the side of the forest, but then the forest was bigger back then. It was home to about 3,600 refugees. The first group of refugees arrived in late 1942, when African workers were still cutting back the forest to erect the buildings. After they initially stayed in temporary accommodation, the Poles were then distributed among 6 villages that made up the settlement. So what do you see when you go there today? This is at least 2013 when I took these pictures. Today, on the premises of the camp, there's Nyabyaya Forestry College that moved after the refugees moved out. They moved in there. So it's used as a forestry college, and many of the buildings are still standing. So the structures you see largely were from then. What's standing out is the Polish cemetery that you see on the bottom left there, where the refugees who perished during the time were buried, and the church next to it. Both are slightly outside the former campgrounds, and the church is used by the local Catholic congregation today. So I want to briefly extend on this church because it's the most significant building that's left from the time. Building for the church started in 1943 with a strong involvement by the refugees. They made the bricks, as you can see down there, and carried the bricks, as you can see up there. And also many Polish women were involved in the heavy building activities. So remember that the majority in the camps were women and children. And most of these women came from the countryside, and they had been peasants before. So they were, as you can see from the image, they were used at least partly to heavy work. Apart from the church, and the church was consecrated and finished building in 1945. Sorry. But apart from the church, the other buildings were mainly built by hundreds of Ugandan workers. Both Ugandan camps had been constructed under the supervision of Polish engineers who were sent from the Polish army, but with the help of hundreds of Ugandan workers. To get an impression of the time, one British visitor described her first impressions when she visited Masindi settlement as follows, quote, "The cottages are mud-built in native style, and it was strange to see white faces instead of black ones peering out of the doorways." One former refugee depicted the camp in Masindi as, quote again, "a secluded, peaceful world and a green paradise with lush gardens around every hut." Set apart from the 6 residential villages, there was also a central compound where British and Polish camp officials lived. All the camps were headed by a British camp commandant who had a Polish internal administration under him. Attached to this compound were the central institutions. There was a 120-bed hospital with 4 doctors. There was a grammar, commercial, and technical school. There was a small post office, a community center that was equipped with a library and a radio, around which the inhabitants gathered every evening to hear the news from the war in Europe. But the refugees were not only in the camp, they also interacted with the surroundings. As I said, hundreds of Ugandan workers did not only build the camp, they were also working and doing most of the heavy work in the camp. They were carrying water and other goods, they were cleaning, guarding, providing foodstuff, etc. And also prominent visitors came to Nyabyaya. This is a drawing by a Polish expressionist painter Felix Topolsky, who also visited the camp, and he drew a picture of showing Tito Mwinyi, the Umukama of Bunyoro, and the British district commissioner at a visit there. Reportedly, the Mukama of Bunyoro showed a great interest in the refugees, and he visited the camp on several occasions. And the refugees were also greatly impressed by him. Some of them also went for a visit to his residence in Hoima. The people I interviewed in Nyabyaya, they remembered the Poles positively, somehow like missionaries, especially the Ugandan Catholics who were connected with the Polish church that is still in use there today. But in the sources, or rather indirect sources, there are also traces of fear that the refugees might stay and take away land. It comes from a rather unusual source. In the late 1950s, the anthropologist John Beattie did extensive work on a spirit possession cult in Bunyoro. He compiled a list of evil Mbandwa spirits that could possess a person. And these Mbandwa spirits included also new additions that came up, like the spirit of tanks or of airplanes. So it was quite a flexible concept. And then there was also the evil spirit of Europeanness, And next to it, there was the evil spirit of Polishness in Polandi. So there was something negative also connected to the image of the Poles back then. And BT explained this by the fear that this large influx of foreigners might stay and permanently take away land. At the time when the refugees were there, it was not clear if they would stay or go again. And Bunyoro had already suffered throughout the colonial period. At the time also, Mukama Winnie led a political campaign to regain the so-called lost counties from Uganda. So there was reason to fear the influx of a large group of foreigners. In hindsight, it's clear that they left, but at that time it was not so obvious for all observers. Nyabyeya refugee camp closed in May 1948, and the remaining refugees were transferred to Kodia. The buildings, as I said, were taken over by the government for the establishment of a forestry college. So now move on to Kodia camp. Kodia was located much closer to Kampala, much more central, I would say, and then Masindi, but it was nevertheless quite isolated from the surrounding settlements. First of all, you have to remember, this is a modern map showing the extent of Kampala, but then at that time it had only some 60,000 inhabitants. So it was much smaller town. Kodia had some 3,000 inhabitants, so it was slightly smaller than Masindi or Nyabyeya. Kodia camp was built on the land of a former livestock farm on a picturesque peninsula in Lake Victoria. It was surrounded by water on most sides. It was only a small and controlled and gated opening to the hills on the mainland. So what do you see today in Kodia? Yeah. First of all buildings were taken down after the refugees had left. So there's no building standing anymore. Even the cemetery was nearly gone. Then Edward Wakiku, who was working there, discovered the history and the remains of the cemetery. And he started renovating the cemetery with support then from the Polish embassy, from former refugees or their descendants, and also from Polish historians from Krakow University in Poland. So in 2009, they were rebuilding the cemetery and setting a memorial stone up here that you can see here. But this was not how it looked back then. Back then, you can see on this, get an impression on these two pictures. It was quite a well-planned settlement and had a rather remarkable street, like a spider web. In its center, you can see in the upper image, in its center stood the large open church on a hill. It was the church building we will see later in the image. It was thatched with papyrus, and then according to the British commandant, quote, it looked more like a Buddhist temple with wings than a Catholic church. The refugees were housed in rectangular residential houses that had 3 rooms, each holding 1 family. And they were built of clay with whitewashed walls and roofs of elephant grass. Apart from this structure, there was a compound on a hill where the administrative workers lived in houses that were of a better standard than the average refugees. This so-called high life, as the inhabitants said to it, Kodia's socio-cultural life in the camp revolved around the 4 social centers. There were choir, folk and theater groups that practiced. There were piano lessons. People did English courses. And furthermore, there were schools, a hospital, regular festivities on Polish national and church holidays, and a lakeside stage for theater performances. But again, let's go on to the connections with people around and work relations here. Outside of the Polish settlements lived many African workers who did most of the heavy work as well as providing the security service. The guards who were guarding the camp came mainly from northern Uganda Acholi region, while people from Buganda did most other jobs. There were also some Rwandan migrant workers who were employed in Kodia, and some tax defaulters who had to work off their debt in the Polish settlement. From interviews I did with former camp workers, they described the relations between African workers and Polish refugees as rather good, especially compared to relations to the British colonizers. Nevertheless, there was a hierarchy in the relations, as in colonial society as a whole. The image on the bottom right of the Polish and Ugandan staff at the camp bakery is quite illustrative, I think, of this hierarchy and distance between the Poles who are standing in the ground in the back and the Ugandans who are sitting in front. The colonial division of labor had lifted these refugees actually in a more powerful position than they had been before, most of them at least. And one example where the Ugandans struggle for better work conditions and actually the anti-colonial struggle or predecessors of it manifested itself in Kodia camp is the Ugandan strikes and riots of January 1945. In connection with these widespread strikes and riots by government employees, there was also one event at Kodia refugee camp. So to push for rises in wages for government employees, the protesters blocked the entrance of the Polish refugee camp. Then the milk lorry was arriving, but the protesters were not letting him through. So they started to spill out the milk cans and quarreling with the camp police. Finally, Kenyan police was brought in to break the protests. And this was done brutally. They were killing 4 people, injuring 11, and imprisoning another 23 protesters. Reportedly, the Polish refugees did not get involved in this conflict, as far as I know. But they were sitting quite literally in the colonizers' camp here. While there's no real indication that the refugees were targeted with these strikes and riots directly, it was rather that the camps were seen as a target because they were important sites of employment. There were many people employed there. There were nodes in the colonial economy, so to say. There were an important sales market for agricultural products. So it was a symbol of, or an important side of employment, important side of the colonial economy. So apart from these, in the work relation, there were also other everyday interaction. Most refugees were women and children, and only few elderly men were there. The refugees were free to move in and out of the camps during daytime. There was also a market just inside the camp, near the gate, where refugees and Ugandan producers and traders from around were meeting and trading there. And the children and youth were roaming around the surroundings, started friendships with one another. As you might know, children are very quick in taking up languages. So some of the Ugandan neighbors learned Polish, some of the Polish children learned Luganda or Kiswahili. And there were also sexual relations between Polish young women and Ugandan men. The British colonial administrators and Polish officials were very concerned over this, but they could not stop it entirely, as most of these interactions relations happened secretly. In February 1944, 2 refugee women were sent to Makindu camp in Kenya because they reportedly had sex with African guards. So they were just deported to Kenya to have them away. And around the camps, there was also the rumor that the babies, that when Polish women got pregnant from African men, that the babies were killed in the camp hospital. Maybe also abortion taking place. It's a rumor, so it's hard to say what's how it was. The camp commandant of Kodia noted in retrospect, now I quote him again, some of the girls had affairs with local Africans, but not many. And I cannot recollect a single case of either an illegitimate half-caste baby or of venereal disease. So it remains unclear whether he covered up the abortions or baby killings, or if there were no children, or he did not know about it. He was also not there all the time in the camp, so just for a shorter period. But what comes out very clear from this quote is that he definitely did not like the idea of Ugandan-Polish relations, and the idea of a larger mixed population that was seen as a danger to colonial rule and the division of black and white. The Polish officials, especially the elder men in power, did also not approve relations of Polish women with African men. They wanted to keep the refugee community nationally Polish and together. There were very few official marriages. Reportedly, but again, this is maybe just a rumor, there was one rich man from Hoima who was owner of a transport company, and he had reportedly 2 Polish wives, but it's unclear from the sources if this is just a rumor or if it's true. What I found in the files was one case of a Polish woman from Kodia who in 1948 converted to Islam in order to marry a man from Jinja, an Islamic Muslim man from Jinja. Due to her conversion, the Polish priest and the British officials could not stop her from marrying. The husband may have been the father of her illegitimate child that was born in 1945 in Kodia. With her move, actually, she was destined to be sent to Great Britain at that time, but she didn't want to. So with marrying her husband from Jinja, she avoided being sent to UK. There might be more Polish Ugandan couples and descendants, but I was not able to trace them at the time when I was there. So let me now contrast 3 perspectives and following the question on where did the Polish refugees belong within the socially divided colonial societies. Now, as I said, it's answered differently from different social positions, different actors. I sketch 3 perspectives here that is still quite a generalization. So first I will take the view of the British administrators and settlers. What mattered first and foremost for them was race. So the refugees were white, and that was the most important aspect in colonial societies for colonial administrators. But on the other hand, they were also refugees. They were Eastern Europeans, they were mostly women, they were Catholics, and what also mattered, they were, quote, largely peasant folk. So we had people who were privileged by race, but marginalized by gender, class, nationality, and their uncertain status of being refugees. The British administrators and settlers regarded them as rather problematic peasants out of place. There was no place for white peasants in the colonies. They were not fitting in there. So this was connected to a concern of the establishment of a poor white class that could blur the boundaries between white and black and damage the image of white superiority, supposed. So the colonial administration treated them paternalistic, like other poor whites before. They isolated them, in this case in camps. They materially supported them through pocket money, allowances, food, housing, education, medical supplies, or raising them up in their living standards. And the third measure was to remove them, pressure to resettle them, to get rid of them as soon as the war was over. The Poles, in turn, remember the time rather positive, for especially the children. Remember the time in the camps as a rather carefree time with lots of friends and adventures, especially in contrast to the hard times in Siberia that they had endured before. Many of them, their parents died or relatives died, or they were fighting for survival there. So now they were, as they said, they came to paradise. And they also felt the privileges of whiteness. On the upper left hand, you see refugees traveling in the first class of a train. Usually they were traveling in the second class, but sometimes even the first class. So they were definitely profiting from colonial society there. In the Polish sources, the newspapers, the self-representation, the Polish allies were always underlining that they were Western European allies and were in common with the British. On the upper right side, you see the administrative building in Kodia, where the Polish and the British flag were flying next to each other, just saying, okay, we are like the British. But from this, religion was very important for the community and also for links to other Catholics. Many of the ordinary refugees remembered and saw themselves as less discriminating and drew some parallels with Polish missionaries who were also partly present in some parts of Africa at that time. But what were the Ugandan perspectives on this? Professor Lwangalunigo, in his seminal article, cited a very interesting newspaper article in the Luganda language newspaper Matalisi in October 1942, describing the refugees who had just arrived. And among other characteristics, it was saying that, quote, they do not practice discrimination. And also from interviews I did with former camp workers and neighbors in Uganda and Tanzania, the Polish refugees were remembered as less distant, less arrogant, less discriminating, and less powerful than the British. As I outlined earlier, the role of the camp as employers and markets played a large role in the local economy. And additionally, the church was important, especially for the Catholic congregation in Nyabyaya. On this image, you see fisher who are selling fish or transporting fish to Masindi camp from Lake Alberta, and down left, Ugandan workers who are working in making bricks for the construction of Kodia. But I think the positive image should, however, not obscure the fact that back then people were also afraid that the refugees might stay and take away land. And also the inequality and privileges the refugees enjoyed may have led to more problems back then than they might remember decades later. So, as I said, in 1948, Masindi camp was closed and the remaining refugees were sent to Kodia. Another 700 refugees from India were transferred to Kodia in 1948 as well. There was independence in India, and the British regarded India as unsafe then. So they were just shipping out the last Polish refugees under their care there. So they were 700 of them came to Kodia as well. In 1951, Kodia was closed and its last inhabitants were eventually transferred to Tengeru in northern Tanganyika. It was the last camp and it closed later in 1951. But where else did they go? So in this chart, you see the whole group of all of Polish refugees in all the different colonies. So after the war in 1945, Poland came under the Soviet sphere of influence and its territory was shifted westwards. So the refugees in Uganda who had suffered from the Soviets, so most of them refused to go back to Poland. They didn't want to go back to a Poland where the Soviet Union was dominating. And also the part of Poland where they came from was by then incorporated into the Soviet Union. So their hometowns and villages were in the Soviet Union and they didn't want to go there. Actually, these are today's parts of Western Belarus and Ukraine that they came from. Only 2,800 of them, the orange part there, went voluntarily back to Poland. But gradually, nearly all of them left. Starting with the war, but mainly in 1947 and 1948, the majority left Africa. 2/3 of them were eventually resettled to the UK. They were joining the demobilized Polish soldiers there. The Polish army that was fighting with the British was eventually allowed to settle in the UK. So they joined them there. Some others were resettled to Australia or Canada, elsewhere. And about 1,000 were allowed to settle in Africa. There were negotiations in 1950 between the UN International Refugee Organization, that was by then responsible for the refugees, and the different colonial governments who were actually quite reluctant to allow more of them to stay. So in the end, 300 were allowed to stay in Kenya, 250 in Tanganyika, 250 in Northern Rhodesia, and 150 in Southern Rhodesia. Most likely, many more would have liked to stay where they were. They were quite happy there, but they were not allowed to stay. The Ugandan colonial government, in turn, was refusing to accept any of the Poles for permanent residency. Some of the few white settlers in Uganda were actually in favor of admitting more Poles and pushed for the government to accept more of them. But the government officially explained in 1949, quote, that, quote, in the interest of the African population, Uganda was not destined for white settlement. The background to this sense must be seen in the increasing anti-colonial opposition to British rule after the war. As you have seen also with the strikes and riots. So the anti-colonial movement was gaining momentum after the war. And the colonial government was fearing more unrest if they would give land and jobs to Polish refugees. Additionally, the British were also fearing that a large Polish community could be a competitor for power there. Actually, there were some Polish exile politicians in London after the war who dreamt of creating a Polish colony in Africa, and the British were not convinced by this at all. So in the end, there was no way to stay for them in Uganda. Only very few individual cases, like the one I mentioned who married Ginger. And no larger Polish community was established. So let me briefly conclude here. To sum it up, the colonial rule was based on the politics of difference. That is, the different people within the polity will be governed differently, as Fred Cooper said it. So, but this meaning of difference was always contested and unstable. The Polish refugee group, as poor white Eastern Europeans, were a challenge to the colonial order of society and its racialized dichotomy and hierarchy. For the British administration, they were accepting the refugees only as they had to contribute to the war effort and only for temporary, as they always underlined in communication with London. They were treating the Poles like earlier white subalterns through isolation, material support, and then fast removal. So the result was a position of privilege and marginalization at the same time. The Poles, as I said, experienced the period as a time of relief and healing after the fight for survival in the Soviet Union. It was like paradise, as some said. And the Polish officials worked hard to keep the exile group nationally Polish and together. While the peasant class majority of Poles had a rather humble outlook. They tried to find any place in the world to settle that was far enough away from the Soviets. They were just not allowed to stay in Uganda. Ugandan perspectives, for Ugandan neighbors and former workers, they understood the Poles as poorer and less distant Europeans. And especially among the youth, there was interaction on an equal footing. Although this was often disliked by the Polish, British, and African and some African officials and guards. And maybe this also helped to demystify the image of whiteness that was created by the colonizers. But if we apply an intersectional perspective on this, taking race, gender, class, nationality, religion, refugee status, all as important and intersecting, if we look through different aspects or through different lenses, so to say, different explanations come up. If we look through a lens of class, we see that maybe the peasant class refugees in the camps had more in common with African peasants from the neighboring settlements. While on the other hand, Polish upper class refugee elites had more in common with the British upper class colonial elites. And if we look through the age of the lens of age, we see that the Polish children and youth were enjoying their time and interacting with African or Ugandan children and youth. In the marketplace, they were going to cockfighting, forming petty gangs, while the Polish parents and officials were more concerned over respectability, discipline, safety, and so on. And if we look through the lens of gender, we see that the Polish and British men were especially fearing relationships between Polish women and African men. And if we look over time, we see that through material support from the colonial administration and international welfare organization and also the Polish diaspora, the Poles changed from a position of destitution and powerlessness when they came to a certain humble material privilege. So they were profiting from colonial society, but despite the fact that they never had intended to go there. So to sum it all up, I would say that the Polish refugees found themselves in the end on the edges of the white colonial society. And with this, thank you for your thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Lingelbach. What an excellent and very interesting talk. So at this point, we'd like to invite Professor Rwangaru Nyigo to give his commentary. Professor, are you on? You'll have to unmute yourself. And in the meantime, people with questions, comments, put them, you can hang on those comments or put them in the chat. And we'll get back to you as soon as we hear from Professor Rwangaru Nyigo. I can see he is on. Professor Rwangaru Nyigo, please unmute yourself. And if your connectivity allows, we'll see your video. Over to you, Professor Rwangaru Nyigo. Professor, you have to unmute yourself.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Professor. We can see you and we can hear you. Good.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I missed the first half due to technological incompetence. But I got Dr. Lingelbach was saying, thank you very much for doing this research. It was the most thorough I know about the Polish refugees. I did some work at Koja, just passed through Nigeria and doing work there. Thank you for bringing the Polish refugees together. White men, the pause on the age of whiteness. And that is the theme of your book. I don't know much about Polish refugees in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Zambia, and Zimbabwe. But in Uganda, the colonial administration tried as possible to bring the Poles and mainstream whiteness. There were around 2,000 British administrators and missionaries, the population, British administrators, missionaries, and so on, was about 2,000. Then all of a sudden, 7,000 whites descended. How they maintain the aura of whiteness. During the Second World War, Ugandans had gone to help the empire to defend it against the Germans and others. And war is a great equalizer. Ugandans were in the same trenches as white men. They suffered the same, they lived the same conditions. It was very difficult to desegregate the soldiers doing the fighting. He saved white men. Africans noticed that there are cowards among whites. In other words, they noticed that all of us, white, black, yellow, we're all human. And given these trying circumstances, that common humanity emerged. So by 1945, and especially when the ex-soldiers came back, the aura with which Africans regarded Europeans had reduced. They were no longer that awesome. So it has to be considered when you consider the white men at the age of whiteness. This has got to be taken into account that this exposure of the Second World War, white men were exposed, now became human, not some demigods. So that was one. The Second World War did a lot to demystify the white man. Uganda has been associated with refugees for a long time. But the phenomenon of white refugees was out of the ordinary. In the Second World War, there were Italian prisoners in Uganda, and I think there were some Greek refugees. And the Italian prisoners of war built Entebbe Airport. And they were white, but they were doing manual work, something that Africans did not associate with whites. But here they were doing manual work, but they're white. They were commanded as prisoners of war and did this work. And the Africans were working. That was that given the same conditions, that humanity comes up. As Dr. Lingelbach have I got it right? The name. He has pointed out, and I got this bit of evidence also. Africans had something to say about these refugees. They were white as the British, but they were different. Now, were they different because of the circumstances under which they found themselves? Or were white men different? Because the Poles were neither colonizer nor colonized. But the ordinary African was the ordinary African aware of this difference. Of course, in their living conditions with the camps, these white men and women lived in huts, in grass-thatched huts. That was the common denominator they shared with the Africans. But theirs were bigger, cleaner. The Africans got to know how these white men lived, how white people lived. Most of them were got to know that. Of course, the same Africans also were working in European households, colonial British European households, where standards were much higher. But all the same, even as refugees, somebody had to work for them. Our refugees, the refugees from Congo, from Sudan, from Rwanda, who worked for themselves. But gangs of Africans who worked in these camps. Some were employed to kill mosquitoes, some to slash around, to build. So the white man in these camps remained white, but not as white as the British colonizers, because those lived in great luxury as far as the Africans were concerned. But these also maintained a certain whiteness. Another thing which equalizes is poverty. I've had stories of poor whites in South Africa. I've had stories, I've seen some poor whites in Britain without an accommodation. I've seen some of these in America. But although poverty equalizes, racism stays strong, stays alive. One of the problems at Koja and at Masindi was that there were many women and children, and not so many men. Ratios were, but not so many men. And the women were young, generally young, and the few boys, men were old. Now, I understand, and there's some evidence that the barriers of race were broken because of the necessity of human. And psychiatry was used a great deal to justify these white aberrations. If had an affair with a black man, especially people who worked in the camps, just carried especially. These were vigorous young men and vigorous Polish women. The British immediately blamed madness. The women must have had psychiatric problems. This is the only way they could justify these aberrations. And because there are so many young women, madness infected many of these girls. In the army, in the army during the war, there were some high-ranking black men. In Uganda, here, we had a captain who was a medical doctor working for Yemen. We also had in the same family, that's where the Apple family. We also had Captain Kagwa, Michael, who eventually became the Katibu of Uganda in 1949. Now, these people commanded at their level. And there was one last incident at the Imperial Hotel after the war, when Captain Kawalia came back and was surrounded. His men were away, and they refused to serve them in the Imperial Hotel. They refused to serve Kawalia. They asked him to go back and be served in the kitchen. And these comrades of his, and he was really ran to them, turned the hotel upside down. They couldn't understand why their boss was being treated the way he was. So then we had 1945, we had, in my writing, I call it revolution. And again, 1949, I call it revolution. Well, there were serious riots in parts of the country, especially around Kampala. And in all this, whiteness was being challenged. Britain came out of the Second World War a broken reed. Two powers at the time, superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And here was Britain, which had become a very second-rate power. With all the resources of empire, which these new powers wanted to also to share. That's why they support the anti-colonial movement. Where did the pause? And one thing that should be made clear, maybe it's, but maybe Dr. Jochen will elaborate later. The fact that the Poles were not a homogeneous entity. We call them Poles, but there were others within this group. And I wish we could elaborate on that one. And within the camp at Goya, anti-Semitism reared its ugly head. I don't know to what extent you have gone into this one, but the British generally in the camps, because we have described Dr. that most of these fellows, the Poles were present. But there were elites, of course, you have talked about the elites in Nairobi and other places, writing and but even at Koja, some of the leaders of the camp were Jews. That's what I found. I may be wrong, but they were Jews. And within the camps, there was someone talking because of this difference. There were some Orthodox Christians, then the majority were Catholics and so on. So it was not a homogeneous Polish identity. And I don't know what they have found at other settlements, Polish settlements. This was a big headache to the British. But generally, in the administration of the settlement, the camp, they favored those who were more educated in the leadership of the camp. Youth found themselves in such commanding positions, was below the British commandant. That is one thing that should be avoided. Now, there are things that, I'm sorry to mention them, but there are things that have shocked me. The Poles were here. You can write the history of the Poles in Africa. That's what you are doing. You are writing the history of the Poles in Africa. And I don't know how much awareness there is in Poland about this particular part of their history. At the beginning of the Ukrainian war, Africans found it very difficult, found it very difficult to enter Poland. I remember seeing an image of one Ghanaian woman who was trying to enter Poland, and it was refused to enter Poland. The reason the Poles said they were only at the meeting of men, and this lady came, Africa, and said, "But I'm a woman," and all the same, they were hesitant to argue. Now, I don't know whether the Poles are aware of this history of them being refugees in Africa or not. If they are not, then this part of their history should be told to them, so that they remember that they were hosted here and that the Africans were very friendly to them. They did not, well, they saw them as white people, but more important, they also saw them as human beings suffering. And of course, during the colonial period, Africans were used to this kind of suffering, but they thought that they are a peg below the British colonizer. This is the kind of history that should not be forgotten. That people in Africa hosted them, were nice to them, worked for them, and maybe this is not the right way to pay back. I don't know whether Dr. Jochen Lingelbach will be brave enough to include something future writing on this one. Our way of their history and the Poles of their history. If they are not aware, somebody should clear this away. Uganda is a tourist country, and we want to diversify our tourism. Already, we have the and it has spawned religious tourism in our country. It's not as much as we would like, but at least we have some religious tourism. Now, the other kind of tourism, you hinted at it. I had a casual look at your book. I hope you send me a copy. And you hinted at memorial tourism. I wish you could say more about this. Because, in fact, before COVID, before 2019, something of that started. On 2 occasions, to successive years, the former interns, there are very few, or their children and or their grandchildren came to Koja, and they went to Masini. And I was hoping that this could be an annual pilgrimage. We really want to receive these people. Some of their roots are here. So in Canada, in Australia, and in Britain, the successors of the ancestors of people there were here in Uganda for almost 10 years. That part of Uganda went wherever they went, and they should come back with a hospital as best as we can. But one thing, since those Poles in Canada and Australia are not poor. We remain poor, but they aren't poor. So
Professor,
many,
in 3 more minutes, if you can wrap it up. Thank you.
Maybe they can come and build something substantial at Masindi and at Koja, so that they can be hosted in their own salubrious environments they used to. And they can make this an investment, a substantial investment, and persuade those who have connections with this place to come and interact with some of us, the grandchildren of those who serve them at these places. Thank you, Dr. Lingelbach, for this great work. Maybe you're well resourced. Looking at the amount of work you have done, the research was well supported. But maybe we've done it about Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania. But maybe you may have some gaps in Zambia and Zimbabwe. I don't know whether you are satisfied with what you have done there, but maybe this is an area where you could expand your research. Thank you very much. I've met you before. I'm looking forward to. But one thing I wish to emphasize is that white is white. And at least in Uganda, the Poles were not at the age of whiteness. They tried to treat them the way the colonizers were treated. Definitely, the natives, they were some other way to benefit. And of course, we are not very vast in the reasons why they came. And they regarded them as white and not on the age of whiteness. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Lingelbach. I'll now like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Edgar Taylor, to curate the rest of the discussion. Over to you, Edgar.
Thank you very much, Christopher. I think first, if Dr. Lingelbach, if you'd like to respond to any of those comments, and then we can move to questions from the audience, which are already appearing in the chat. So, but please go ahead and respond to as much of Professor Lingelbach's comments as you'd like.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor, for these comments. Unfortunately, some parts I didn't get due to the connection. I didn't hear, but I think there are very many points that you touched upon that are very important for me also. I just want to try to respond shortly to some that I understood. Yeah, I think also that was what you also wrote in your article back then, was that the war, the Second World War, was an equalizer, or that it demystified whiteness. And I think that the story of the Polish refugees also adds to this development at the same time, and thereby helping the anti-colonial movement to grow afterwards. So yeah, I think that's. You also mentioned Greek refugees. So what I also did just recently was research on Greek refugees who had been to the Congo. At the same time, there were some 2,500 refugees from Greece who were then sent to the Congo. There were also 500 in Tanganyika, and maybe there were some smaller numbers in Uganda. They went through Uganda to the Congo, parts of them. So maybe that's also how they come up here, and maybe also some stayed in Uganda. I'm not really sure about this. It's all work that I have the feeling it still needs to be discovered. And also that's another point that you raised that I think it's really important, the awareness of people in Europe, in Poland, that this happened. I think some people in Poland are aware. There's some Polish language literature also on this, and I hope also to make it more publicly known. But unfortunately, not all people know it, and not all draw the right conclusion, I would say, because I think in Poland, as in Germany and in Europe, it's very much people who are against accepting refugees. They are very often due to racist reasons, that they don't want to accept refugees. And this can be also seen in the recent treatment of Ukrainian refugees in Europe, who were treated better than refugees from Africa. And I think that's important then to say. But this there was a time when people were fleeing from Europe to Africa, not the other way around. So it's important to always accept refugees, no matter where they come from. So yeah, I try to make my small contribution to this by making this history more known in Europe, and in Uganda as well. Yeah. Thank you so much for all your comments, and I really hope that we will see us in person again the next time I manage to come to Uganda, and then I will bring a copy of my book that I wanted to give you a long time ago, but then the pandemic hindered me from coming. So yeah, thank you very much for all your many insightful comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been a very rich talk, and I think it opens up a lot of questions and discussion. There's already a comment here in the chat from Dr. Ria Kapoor. I don't know if Dr. Kapoor, if you would like to unmute and ask your question aloud, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. I really learned so much from it. And my comment was mostly one of just astonishment, because so much of what seems to be going on with the Poles and indeed wider European refugees in Egypt and in India is also happening clearly in Uganda and elsewhere in Africa. So it's astonishing. I suspect some of the same people were involved really in coming up with this. But my big question really had to do with the fact that UNRWA and IRO, so like the foundation stones for what becomes the current refugee convention, they come and take charge of European refugees regardless of where they are in colonial territories. They, they as you mentioned about the Polish woman who was due to go to Britain, I assume she was part of one of these schemes to resettle her as part of like a labor shortage or something like Westward Ho. But what these operations also notably do not do is support colonial territories in sort of reconstruction activities of their own, right? They notably leave them out. So I wondered, like, if the aftermath of crises like the and of experiences of hosting groups like the Poles also shapes Ugandan approaches in the decades to come with the international order more broadly, but also how rights are thought about generally. And as you know, this colonial difference, that Cooper's idea of colonial difference, really, does it become resisted? Does it become reshaped? Or is it just replayed over and over again? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. It's really interesting to see how like these UN organizations then take over there and take care for refugees everywhere around the world, as long as they were from Europe, and leaving aside other refugees who might be there. So just a quick note on UNRWA. They were officially responsible for the Polish refugees in the British colonies, but they did only organize the repatriation. They did not, and they were financing them, but the management of the refugees in the camps was still the colonial administration doing this. The National Refugee Organization became a bit more involved, but they were also, again, mainly trying to settle the refugees somewhere else, and then debating with the colonial governments or other governments to find any place anywhere. So this is what the IRO was mainly doing there. The influence of this experience on Ugandan refugee policy afterwards, I think that's quite a important but also hard to answer question. I mean, I tried a bit, and I would say my take on this is I still need more proof for this. But my idea or my take is, if I compare Ugandan approach to refugees, that is really open and very welcoming for refugees. Compare this and giving refugees much possibilities to earn their own, do their own farming, earn their own life in the country. And then if I compare it with Kenya, that it follows a much more restrictive approach. And I think this can also be traced back, if I compare this with the treatment of the Polish refugees. There were many more accepted in Uganda, only few in Kenya. And in Kenya, there were more prisoners of war. They had more closed camps, like they now have more closed camps in Uganda, more closed and less open. So I think there could be made a point for that this also influenced the later experience or the later treatment of refugees. But yeah, it's a big question, and thank you for this.
Thank you. We have one more question in the chat before we go to the questions from the room. From Rebecca Rocca, excuse me. Excuse me, sorry. From Rebecca Roccabucosa. Rebecca, would you like to unmute and ask your question, or please go ahead. So she has a difficult connection, but I can just read the question for the benefit of everyone else. Given that most of the refugees were children and women, what role did these demographics play in how race relations worked out? Do you see this playing out in the same way had the Poles been primarily men, for example?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it is it did make a large difference. I mean, it's hard to try to think what was the other what would have been the other case that was not existing. But I think in regard to the women and children, they were very much guarded and sheltered or yeah, controlled also by men in the end, by British and Polish men in the administration. And so I think if it would have been a camp of Polish men, I think they would be quite different. But it's hard to imagine how it would have played out. But what definitely played out in the camps was this idea of these are women and children, and we have to protect them, and we have to control them by protecting them at the same time. Maybe that just I hope it answered a bit of your question, but yeah, kind of a tough question. Thank you. Something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. We have maybe before we move on to David Chimba's question, if there are questions from the room, if Christopher, if you could moderate those, and it depends how many we have, whether we want to take maybe two at a time.
Can we have David Chimba to ask his question, and then we can get to the physical audience? Yes.
That'd be fantastic. David, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question directly.
I did want to unmute. I thought the question is very clear, but thank you so much, Joe. This is very fascinating. I was struck when I heard you say settlements, and you said I heard you say in the archives you consulted they were referred to as settlements. So for me, that is quite stable. We see that language again, the language of settlements being deployed. Why did the British call them settlement then and not camp, as you consulted? Of course, this is also connected to the entire policy of the governance of refugees then and now. Connectedly is the question of
It seems we've lost David temporarily, I hope. But I think the question, he raised while we wait for him to, oh, he's back. Hello, David.
Sorry, I think sorry, my internet. Yeah, I'm in the thick of Western Uganda, near the where Johan is talking about. So the question is whether the current regime, can you say that there is evidence that the current regime has read the colonial archives very well, from where they have deployed both the discourse and the praxis of refugee management, as we see it's the language of commandant, ship, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David, for a question. I hope I got it right. I mean, I read it in the chat. So first of all, maybe I was a bit unclear here. The British administration actually was using camp mainly. Sorry, that maybe came out wrong when I was talking. They were deliberately using refugee camp most of the time. Sometimes they said settlement, but usually they said refugee camp. While on the other hand, the Polish internal administration, they were using osiedle, that's settlement. So they were saying settlement. So the British had a camp commandant, was the leader of the British of the refugee camps, was the camp commandant. But then under him, the Polish leader was the settlement leader. So in this internal administration, and I think that this tells something. And I think it's right that you point this out. This is quite important how people call something. So I think the colonial administration wanted to make sure this is just temporal. They are not going to stay here. So they were really trying to make this clear by calling it refugee camp. And also in the colonial legislation that they were passing, there was refugee camp was written in there. So sometimes they also slipped a bit and they were writing of settlement, but usually they were saying camp. So if the post-independent Ugandan government administration did read the colonial archive, I'm not sure. I have no idea. But maybe I guess you know it better than me. I think if they read into the legislation of the time, then it would have been camp actually. So yeah. But thank you for raising this. This is really important, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if there's Christopher, if there are questions in the room, I could, oops.
Yes, there are some questions. So I'll allow my colleagues to ask their questions. Please turn on your microphone and then you go ahead and ask your question. Moses? Nicholas? Or you can come here and use mine.
It seems we've lost the camera for the room, but that's fine. We can still hear you, so.
Thanks, Doctor, for organizing the meeting. The question is the relationship between the refugees and the Ugandans. Why is it that we are seeing that whoever tried to have some kind of marital status was being exiled? Because the first one from your presentation, I heard that the first woman, she was taken to Kenya. The second one, she was taken back to Britain. From your research, what was the reason behind that? Was it a kind of racism, or I'd like to understand something behind it, Doctor. Thank you.
You have another question? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joachim, for your contribution about the North-South mobility. I was just curious about the way of life of the Poles in Uganda, the activities, the social life, the economic activities, and generally, it seems that they were integrating. Then why was the colonial state worried about the relationship between Ugandans and the Poles at Koja? Thank you.
Okay, probably we can allow Jochen to respond to. Do you want to add one more? Let me slot in mine. So you talked about, gave a good description of those Polish refugees. They are peasants, but you also showed pictures. They are constructing churches and other structures. And I was curious about, like, more detail about those women and the men in there. Did they have some other skills that we might know? And secondly, refugees tend to go out of the settlements or the camps, and David is brought out these two terms. And you, of course, mentioned those who went out to seek marriage and that kind of stuff. But they also tend to get out of camps and settlements looking for better livelihood options. These are white people. And there was a privileged white community, especially in the urban centers like Kampala. And so I'm wondering, do we have cases of, probably I missed it, but do we have cases of Poles that went out of these camps to go to Kampala, mix, or try to start a life in Kampala outside the camps, notwithstanding that the British tried to take them to those rural areas? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for all these questions. I don't have all names, but of all the people, but I will just go through it.
The first one was Moses.
Okay.
The first question was Moses.
Mm-hmm.
And the second question was Nicholas.
Okay.
And
Mm-hmm.
the last one, Christopher.
Yeah. The last one I knew, but the others I didn't get the name. So, okay, perfect. So I just go through the three. Thank you very much for these detailed and rich questions. The observation of Moses that people were forced into exile when they wanted to marry, and if it has to do with racism, I'm quite sure it has. I think more often than not, or first of all, I think it was not illegal to marry people of different racial categorizations. That was not illegal by law at that time in Uganda. But it was strongly, the colonial administration was strongly against it. And also the Polish officials were strongly against it. And that's where this one case of this one woman that I found in the files comes up, because she converted to Islam. Because when people wanted to marry, they had to go to a Polish priest so that the Polish priest says, this is okay, you can marry. But then they were saying, like, oh, they tried to convince them not to marry. And then there's this case of the two people who were then sent away to Kenya. So there was a very strong movement against it, although it was not illegal, but it was, and I definitely think that has to do with racism. So they didn't want to have Polish, African, or black and white people marrying. And so, yeah, because it's really, and this also goes to the question of Nicholas. So why was the colonial administrations worried when Polish and Ugandans were having a good time with each other, not only in sexual relations, but also in everyday friendships and playing around? I think this all goes down to racism and to this difference that was so enshrined in colonial society, and that was so important for colonial society to function, that white and black was distance, and that there was this image of white people being superior. But in the end, if people know each other, then they know they are people like people, humans. So that's why this distance was always kept up in the colonies. And your question, Christopher, or your questions, yeah, most definitely, they were also refugees who were skilled in other things. There were craftsmen in the camps. There were people. There were women who made clothes. There were hat makers, and so all kinds of trades. The people, they were from all kinds of background. They were when they were deported in the beginning. So they were also professionals. There were professors. There were school headmasters and doctors among them. So it was really, I always say, like, but the majority were peasants from the rural periphery, but also others among them. I mean, the people with a certain education, they were the ones who were then in power in the camps. There were Polish school system with Polish teachers, and these were mostly of the people who were more educated. And people going out of the camp, some tried. I mean, some tried to set up some trade, sometimes illicit trade. So there was not, especially during wartime, it was very controlled, the economy. So people were nevertheless trading things that were not allowed, but they did it. So that's how it came into the files then when they were caught. And there were some few Polish refugees who were in formal employment outside of the camps, but it was always a special permission they needed to get. There were some few, at least of which I heard, that were working for British settlers or British families, working in their families as a household help. And there's one I'm just now aware of who worked for the electricity board. So there were some few people who work in formal employment outside, but it always needed a special permission. So it was not many. Yeah.
Thank you for those responses. I wonder if we could take, I'd like to ask a question, but if there are others, any more in the room, please, Christopher, you can insert them. But I wanted to ask two questions. One is a nuts and bolts question, and the other is a big picture question. The first one is, if just for the benefit of those who have not read the book, about your sources, and especially the languages of those sources and where they're located. If you could just say a bit more about, it seems a project that requires not just say Ugandan and then colonial metropolitan archives, but looking around. And so how did you go about identifying sources that would both archival sources, but then also it seems you've done quite a bit of interviews as well, both within Uganda and outside. And the second question is, I'm thinking about this alongside, works by other scholars in refugee studies, or I don't know if it would be called that, but say Pamela Ballinger's work about Italians in Libya, in North Africa, being expelled. And in that case, I'm thinking about that article in particular, it was a part of a kind of a fascist project of settlement by the Italians that then, of course, after World War II they become kind of orphaned politically and eventually are expelled from Italy. And in that case, it's a story of decolonization. And I wonder about how you relate your story to the history of decolonization in East Africa. I think this gets at, part of your answer to Nicholas's and Moses's questions intersects with, say, the work of Karina Ray about the color line in colonial Africa. And I guess what I'm pushing at is whether the significance of your title is that a story like this, it seems in some ways you're suggesting that it can blur the lines or complicate the story of white and black. But as Professor Lanigo said, this was a colonial setting. In some ways, the project of settling refugees European refugees in camps was integral to the colonial project itself. It was not a deviation. It reinforced whiteness in many ways. So I wonder if you could sort of respond to that, how your work fits into literature on those themes as well. And thank you. This was really a fascinating talk.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can I answer directly? Yeah, okay. Yeah, the sources, that's so I was in the archives. So this is I was in the archives in London, the colonial archives, obviously. Some in Oxford in the special collections, some former private papers of colonial officials. I was in Nairobi in the archives. I was in Dar es Salaam in the archives, the National Archives. So this is all the British colonial side, so to say. Then I was in Paris, where the archives of the International Refugee Organization are located. Who was responsible for the last time. Then, as I said, in 2013, I did interviews in Uganda and in Tanzania with former camp workers there, and in Tanzania also with one former refugee from Poland who was still living in Arusha at that time. Is by now passed away, but and then I looked in London also into Polish sources that are there. There's a Polish exile or a Polish cultural center and archive, and they have the newspapers. There were a whole range of newspapers published by the Polish administration and the Polish refugees in Polish language, but they were printed in Nairobi and distributed in the camps. So I looked at these. So I learned Polish for this, which I did not speak before. As regards the question of language, in Uganda, I relied on translation of people who helped me there. I speak Swahili, but that didn't help me so much in neither Nabia nor Kodja. In Tanzania, I did the interviews in Kiswahili. So did I cover all my sources? I think most. And then there are bits and pieces here and there. So I was also in New York in the UN archives, where the UNRWA, some UNRWA sources are also mentioning the Poles. So it's quite scattered all over. But yeah, there's something. I was not in the Ugandan National Archives yet, because at that time I was in Uganda, the archive was not functioning. So this is still my gap, apart from other gaps that I definitely have. I didn't go to the Zambian archives and not in Zimbabwe. So there's still a lot, but it's a large topic. Your other question on the history of decolonization and refugees and whiteness. So yeah, this is really the big question. I think the refugees were a challenge to late colonial rule, so, and to the image of whiteness. So that's why they had the potential to transgress. But then in the end, they were, as also Professor Wangalunigo said, they were then brought into line and brought into whiteness again. So that's why I said, because when I started with this, with this research, I was asking myself, okay, are they standing completely outside of this colonial dichotomy of black and white? But then in the end, they were incorporated into the white part of society. And that I think that's the work of the colonial administration that was doing here. In isolating them, in privileging them, lifting them up, so to make this difference clear, and then getting rid of them, but also all the time controlling them as far as possible. But in the end, also, I think it did. There was potential in the interaction of people that also unsettled whiteness and with this unsettled colonial rule. So I think there's a potential, but it was also an active work of the administration in controlling this potential. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, for the answers to those questions. I'll now just hand it over to my colleague, Christopher Mohosi, to bring us to a close.
Well, we've already come to a close, so I'll not do much other than to thank you, our presenter, to thank you, Professor Wangalunigo, to thank you, my colleague, Edgar, for co-hosting this, setting it up, and of course, to thank you, our audience, the physical audience with me here, and the online audience. We thank you for being with us for the 2 hours. And let me remind all of us that these seminars are ongoing, so we will be having other seminars in the pipeline. Dr. Edgar advertised this. If you follow us, myself and Dr. Edgar on Twitter, and indeed the history department will be showing, will be kind of advertising these upcoming seminars. But for now, I want to thank you once again and hope you have a good day wherever you are. Thank you and cheers. Bye.